Egyptian planners devoted significant effort to deceiving U.S. and Israeli aerial and satellite reconnaissance. They assumed American satellites and Israeli aircraft were monitoring their movements and developed strategies to avoid detection, either by masking activity or timing it precisely. Crucially, they synchronized key preparations with the known dead periods in U.S. satellite coverage. While the exact orbits of the KH-8 Gambit satellites were classified, it is widely believed that Egypt had obtained this information. Armed with this knowledge, the Egyptian military would pause or camouflage sensitive activities during anticipated satellite overflights, resuming movement only when the skies were blind. One example when a senior CIA imagery officer, Dino Brugioni, recounted that the Egyptians were playing a shell game with the missile sites to confound Israeli and U.S. reconnaissance. One day, a SAM-2 site would be observed. The next day, its equipment had been moved out. The following day, SAM-3 equipment would be installed at the same location, causing great confusion for U.S. intelligence analysts trying to map Egypt's SAM network. This constant shuffling of air defense units ensured that no recon flight ever saw the full picture. Secretary of State William Rogers was briefed in September 1970 on how Egyptian SAMs popped in and out of existence on successive days, making up-to-the-minute tracking nearly impossible. When the war began, Israel's planned aerial surveillance and air support attacks were badly surprised by SAMs in places they didn't expect. In fact, the Egyptians had established an impressive aerial umbrella all along the canal by October 1973, a mix of SAM-2, SAM-3, and mobile SAM-6 batteries, which deterred Israeli pre-war reconnaissance flights entirely. By denying aerial observation and playing hide-and-seek with key assets, Egypt ensured that even if the US or Israel attempted last-minute reconnaissance, they would either not see the real deployments or be unable to interpret them correctly. Egypt's evasion tactics extended even to seemingly mundane activities. For example, in September 1973, the Egyptian army undertook a maintenance campaign where scores of tanks and armored vehicles were sent to repair workshops near the canal, allegedly due to breakdowns. To outside observers, this looked like a rash of mechanical failures plaguing Egypt's armor. In reality, those tanks were fully operational and quietly parked in assembly areas closer to the front, ready to join the offensive. The ruse was so effective that Israeli intelligence interpreted the convoys of tanks heading to the front for repairs as a sign of Egyptian weakness. This carefully timed choreography of alerts and lulls misled Israeli intelligence and conditioned them to dismiss subsequent real movements as drills. According to military historian Professor John Ferris, there are typically two forms of deception in warfare: to mislead and to confuse. But Sadat introduced a third: sedation. By planting and reinforcing the so-called concept within Israel's military and political elite, he lulled them into a false sense of security. He fed Israel a slow, steady stream of carefully crafted signals to dull their alertness. Egypt didn't just deceive on the battlefield, it deceived in headlines. The media became an extension of military planning, with carefully crafted narratives designed to mislead, delay, and disarm the judgment of Israeli intelligence, foreign diplomats, and even Egypt's Arab allies. They emphasized the supposed decline in Egyptian military readiness following the expulsion of Soviet advisors. In reality, once the Soviets had left, the Egyptians quietly made critical improvements and modifications to their equipment, changes that would have been difficult under direct Soviet oversight. The T-34 tank, for instance, was upgraded to travel 4,000 kilometers on its tracks instead of just 1,000. Modifications to SAM systems, radar equipment, and electronic countermeasures were kept hidden from Israeli intelligence and only became apparent once the war began. The Egyptian Navy announced retraining efforts in mine-laying operations, claiming poor performance, But in reality, it was laying mines to blockade Israeli ports. Meanwhile, circulated false reports that 2 submarines were undergoing maintenance in Pakistan. In truth, those submarines had already deployed, quietly taking positions to help enforce a maritime blockade. Sadat worked to maintain the illusion that Egypt was committed to a diplomatic path. He repeatedly made public statements hinting at peaceful intentions or internal difficulties, while subtly warning of an inevitable confrontation. This ambiguity created strategic confusion, keeping foreign observers and Israeli intelligence uncertain about Egypt's true intentions. Egypt had appeared to pursue peace, buying time while quietly preparing for war. Official schedules and public statements were carefully curated to avoid raising suspicion. The Ministry of Defense even announced that soldiers could register for the pilgrimage to Mecca, scheduled for the end of October, just days before hostilities began. President Sadat told a foreign envoy he intended to attend the UN General Assembly in October, while a meeting between the Egyptian and Romanian defense ministers was scheduled for October 8th. Egyptian foreign ministry officials abroad were not recalled prior to the attack, including the foreign minister himself, reducing the risk of triggering Israeli or allied intelligence alerts through intercepted diplomatic traffic. A sudden recall might have been interpreted as a signal that war was imminent. Egyptian troops along the Suez Canal were instructed to appear relaxed, walking without uniforms or weapons, fishing, and even swimming in the canal. Israeli forces watching from the Bar-Lev line interpreted these scenes as evidence of routine exercises rather than imminent war. On October 6th, Israeli soldiers recounted that the sunbathers disappeared before artillery barrages began hammering the Bar-Lev line. In August 1971, President Sadat convened a select group of generals at his summer residence, officers who would play a central role in preparing for the Yom Kippur War. According to Field Marshal Abdelghani El-Ghamasi, Sadat opened the meeting with a clear message. "I am warning you against routine military thinking. The enemy expects us to follow that path. Our victory must be built on surprise." That surprise would strike at the heart of Israeli intelligence.
סאדאת הודיע שהוא יתקוף כעבור חודש, והוא הודיע שהוא יתקוף כעבור 3 חודשים, והוא הודיע שהוא יתקוף עד סוף 71, והוא הודיע שהוא יתקוף עד סוף 72, והוא הודיע שהוא יתקוף בהתחלת 73, והייתה לנו התראה על מלחמה באמצע 73 בחודש יוני. היו לנו הרבה מאוד התראות.
Egypt understood that Israel needed to see its troop movements along the Suez Canal as routine. In 1973 alone, Egyptian forces mobilized and demobilized 22 times before the war actually began. Units were repeatedly moved to the canal, tank ramps were built, and openings were carved into defensive earthworks, all clear signs of preparation for an attack. In May 1973, the IDF responded to one of these alerts by mobilizing at a cost of $20 million only for Egypt to stand down once again. After that, the trap was set. Israeli intelligence personnel began weighing the economic cost of false alarms rather than focusing on the mounting warning signs. Instead of passing on raw indicators to political leadership, they filtered their reports through cost-benefit assumptions that weren't theirs to make. As historian Abraham Rabinovich writes, the Egyptians brilliantly orchestrated their activities to fall in the gaps of Israeli and American vision, both literal and figurative. In the war's aftermath, U.S. and Israeli analysts alike marveled at the operational security and deception that had neutralized their surveillance. Former CIA Director William Colby noted that the Egyptians' movements had been so well timed and concealed that they denied us the unmistakable indicators we relied upon. One example was a CIA report issued on October 5th, just one day before the war began. The exercise and alert activities underway in Egypt may be on a somewhat larger scale and more realistic than previous exercises, but they do not appear to be preparing for a military offensive against Israel. And in this master plan, Sadat would rely on an extraordinary asset, a man who would become the ultimate weapon of deception. Dr. Ashraf Marwan, who walked into the Israeli embassy in London with an irresistible offer, But beneath the surface, Marwan was playing a far more dangerous game. But how did he do it? President Sadat decided to play the game on his own terms. Instead of the Mossad seeking out the Vault of Secrets, Sadat brought the vault directly to them. That very act unsettled and completely disoriented the heads of Israeli intelligence. Marwan misled Israel twice before the war, in late 1972 and again in April 1973, by warning of imminent Egyptian attacks that never came. The April alert, in particular, triggered a full-scale mobilization and sustained high alert, only for Israeli forces to stand down days later. These false alarms created a classic cry-wolf effect. In hindsight, these warnings appear to have been part of a calculated strategy. By provoking premature Israeli responses, Marwan have enabled the Egyptians to study Israeli mobilization patterns and refine their own operational planning ahead of the real attack. Sadat defined the goal of the war simply to break the ceasefire and spark an international crisis. On that basis, the war planners shaped its overall concept. The strategic aim was to disrupt the existing balance of power in the region and to challenge Israel's sense of security and the assumptions behind its military doctrine. The plan called for an offensive operation to liberate the occupied land in stages, in line with the armed forces' capabilities. It also aimed to inflict the greatest possible losses on Israel, in both personnel and equipment, to convince it that the continued occupation of Egyptian territory would come at an unbearable cost.